That's very interesting. And I guess, it's interesting that they don't include all the numbers that we would include in there. So it's a different way, like you said, it's a different way of accounting for things. So it seems like, if I'm hearing you correctly, China is underreporting how much their PLA budget is compared to what we're finding out.
Yeah, I mean, I think U.S. European organizations can estimate what they think China's total spending is compared to what their declared spending is.
I'm not surprised.
But it's in an order of about 40% gap between our estimates and reporting. But as I pointed out, comparisons are difficult to make when it comes to how China spends its money, what it spends it towards, and how other militaries are postured.
So what is the relative strength of Chinese military under Xi Jinping compared to U.S. and I guess other countries as well, but more importantly, the U.S.?
So it's very difficult to compare the two militaries because they are so fundamentally different. And as I mentioned, China primarily operates on its own periphery, with a few exceptions. It generally is postured and prepared and structured to fight close to home, whereas the U.S. is postured to fight globally, not at home. So in some ways, they're very different. One also has to remember the major political differences. The People's Liberation Army is fundamentally different than the U.S. military. The PLA is the armed wing of the Communist Party, and their primary mission is to defend the party, while the U.S. military is sworn to defend the country and the Constitution. So their basic principle is very different, and that helps explain why the U.S. seeks to defend itself abroad, and the PLA seeks to defend the party, which operates primarily at home. So from that perspective, they're quite different. Their strengths are also very difficult to measure, and that's partly a function of the way we perceive modern warfare. It's not about symmetrical matchups. It's difficult to say, well, China has this number of ships and the U.S. has this number of ships in the Pacific theater, for example. Partly because if there were a conflict, the U.S. would be bringing forces from other parts of the globe, so those numbers would accordion. They would change, they would grow and shrink as a conflict develops. While at the same time, you also have aspects that are very difficult to compare, and capabilities that are absolutely crucial to a conflict that are difficult to measure. I mean, how do you measure capabilities in space? How do you measure capabilities in cyber? How do you measure, for instance, all of the capabilities that are assigned to, in the PLA's case, the Strategic Support Force? So in that respect, you've got really the sort of the nuances of the two that really defy comparison. And likewise, the U.S. has been engaged in various forms of warfare and combat since 2001, in giving the U.S. military a specific type of experiences that potentially give it an advantage, though it's unclear if those advantages that the U.S. has would apply, and those experiences the U.S. have would apply to a conflict with China, which would be a very different type of conflict than what the U.S. is engaged in. So I think there's enough unknowns here that I'm not comfortable making a prediction how the two militaries would match up.
Totally understandable. So I don't want to put you in the hot seat or anything, but you did mention that the PLA, they protect the party. And I speak with a lot of my Chinese American colleagues here, and many of them don't understand that the PLA and the local police, and then there's the army, they're all different. So can you just briefly kind of distinguish for our American audience the difference between the PLA and everything else?
Well, I think, and this is particularly valid under Xi Jinping, the importance of loyalty to the party and what they refer to as political work or party building work, where essentially the degree and level of indoctrination that that PLA officers and now increasingly civilian law enforcement and other organs have to undergo is quite dramatic compared to, for instance, the Hu Jintao, Jiang Zemin era. So the notion of party loyalty is really drummed into the leadership of the Chinese military, and that ethos goes down to the grassroots level, to each individual soldier. So potentially that's an area of comparison, again, making it very difficult to associate with the United States, where the Army and the military strives to be apolitical. And when military officers or retired military officers get involved with politics, there's a certain degree of discomfort with that in U.S. society. But in China, it's necessary. A successful officer in the PLA must be and demonstrate their political loyalty. They must be politically indoctrinated, and they have cadres specifically trained and responsible for political indoctrination. The commissar concept, and that's very important. And again, this gets to the very fundamental communist doctrine, right? I mean, Mao said that the party must control the gun. So as a result, the party operates within the military in a very, very robust way and in a very integrated way. So political indoctrination and political loyalty are essential factors for evaluating the effectiveness of China's military in a way that's unthinkable in the United States. And this is true for almost any unit in the government now, including, say, the police force. So it'd be very difficult to compare to, say, the New York City Police Department. You walk into a precinct and you may have a picture of the mayor on the wall because that's where the budget comes from, but you don't have your policemen pledging their allegiance to the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. They're there to protect the citizens of New York. They're not there to protect the party or the politician. So I think that's an important distinction that is sometimes lost when we're comparing the two or considering how cooperation between the two sides is structured.
I completely agree with that assessment. It's very hard, especially for a lot of Americans, to understand how different the Chinese system is, not just in the military, but in a lot of aspects too. So thank you for clarifying that. I know that the Chinese military, they've never been in hot war. None of the officers have ever been in active war. So given that background, do you think we'll ever get into hot war with China since they're so inexperienced?
Well, I think there's a few things that are certain, and one of those certainties is that China has been preparing for a military conflict with the United States for decades. So certainly Beijing thinks that it's possible. I would think the most likely scenario would be Taiwan, at least the most likely scenario that I can envision. I think it's important to note that I think the likelihood of an accident between the U.S. and Chinese militaries sparking war is highly unlikely. Both sides have invested pretty heavily in risk reduction measures, both at the strategic and the operational levels. And specifically referring to in 2014 and 15, the U.S. and Chinese militaries agreed on made a series of agreements. One of them was on the rules of behavior for unplanned, unexpected air and maritime encounters, where if a Chinese plane and a U.S. plane are intercepting one another, or two ships are operating in close proximity, that they would have agreed to rules of the road for how they would operate safely in close proximity to one another. The military term for that is deconfliction. And so at that operational level, there's been significant investment in laying the groundwork for how operators, pilots, and ship drivers can operate safely. And then another important operational mechanism was the Military Maritime Consultative Agreement, known as the MMCA, which was agreed to in 1997, which provides for the U.S. and Chinese militaries to meet 3 times a year, to discuss operational safety. So in the past, when, say, a U.S. ship and a Chinese ship have come too close to one another, the two sides will notify each other about their perception of what just happened, but then they'll agree to discuss it at the next MMCA meeting. So these are very important operational risk reduction measures that have served us well since, as I said, 1997, and then were reinvigorated in 2014. There was also a strategic agreement where the two sides would exchange information to try to build some degree of mutual trust, but really to reduce the risk of misperception. So that created channels between the Department of Defense and the PLA to exchange high-level information, and that includes the use of the defense telephone link. So basically the ability to use secure communications in a time of crisis. So in 2015, the two sides agreed to a set of protocols for how they would use the defense telephone link, sometimes called the hotline, to potentially reduce the risk of a crisis escalating, or the two sides misperceiving the actions of the other. So I think a great deal has been invested in the bilateral military relationship to ensure that an accident isn't the cause of a conflict that neither side wants. But that said, I think the more likely scenario would be Taiwan, where Xi Jinping has made unification with Taiwan a very key part of his legacy, and I'm concerned that he may decide that the best option to achieve that political objective is the use of military force.
So, what are your opinions on China under Xi Jinping rule versus his predecessors, if you have any at all?
Well, I mean, Xi Jinping himself and his propaganda machine has declared that it is a new era. And I think when he first came into office, the U.S. was somewhat dismissive of that term, whether it was being used as a new era of great power relations or a new era of this or that. I think the U.S. side somewhat blew it off as a slogan, but really what it was some signaling that there was a new leader and it was going to be fundamentally different than his predecessor. So I think Xi Jinping has fundamentally changed governance in China. I mean, he's written books to that effect about how he has sought to change internal governance within China. And he's made the Communist Party to be the dominant political force, economic force, societal force in the entire country. And that's a really dramatic shift from the Hu Jintao, Jiang Zemin, Deng Xiaoping era, where we had seen slow and steady emergence of things like civil society, the strengthening of the private sector in the economy, the growth of individual freedoms for things like individuals and the media. And I think all of that has regressed under Xi Jinping. So it's a very different society now. It's much more politicized. The party has taken a lead in all things in the country in a way that makes it fundamentally different from Xi Jinping's predecessors. And that presents a challenge for the United States and how they engage China. In some ways, it can be partly because China is a political pressure cooker. And those internal tensions that occur can affect Chinese policymaking in ways that's difficult for the U.S. to anticipate or adapt to. In other ways, it makes it difficult to use somewhat traditional means of building trust and building shared interests, including free and fair trade, people-to-people ties. It's very difficult to have effective people-to-people ties when you're sending, say, American school children to engage with Chinese counterparts, but the Chinese counterparts are effectively deploying Chinese propaganda and political lectures and are essentially doing the bidding of the government and the party, whereas the U.S. counterparts are expressing their personal opinions and their personal viewpoints in a way that doesn't you're comparing apples to oranges here. So you can't rely on people-to-people connections. You can't rely on even trade at this point to create a foundation for the bilateral relationship. So that makes it very difficult to sustain a relationship with China when you don't have that ballast.
Wow, that's interesting. So because people are less likely to engage in diplomacy, it seems like maybe conflict is unavoidable, right? At this point, I'm
not that pessimistic.
Okay.
I don't think either the United States or China wants to have a war with each other. I think both sides recognize the cost that each would entail. The cost would be different for the two sides, but they would be significant. In some cases, I think the incentives to avoid conflict are greater than the incentives to enter into a conflict. So at that point, I think we are looking at a period of sustained tension, but not necessarily conflict. But that said, the political demands within China may force Xi Jinping's hand to take an action that draws the U.S. into conflict with China, and that could be a result of misperception, could be poor analysis in Beijing that concludes that the U.S. won't take a risk, or that the U.S. Views its interests differently than it actually does. So that threat, that risk of misperception, miscalculation is always there.
So I guess putting hot war and cold war aside, there's also another type of warfare, cyber warfare, something China's very good at. And do you think that the cyber warfare is replacing traditional warfare? And do you think the U.S. is equipped to defend itself against China and other foreign enemies in the cyber world?
So that's a great question. And you mentioned China's very good at it. China's very good at a lot of things. And maybe to put your question into some context, cyber can be a lot of things. And it's also important to remember that cyber is a means to an end. So cyber is also part of a much bigger campaign, some that you can sometimes refer to as gray zone actions or operations. And gray zone would refer to activities or actions that are assertive or aggressive or adversarial, but they fall below the threshold of conflict or war. So for example, China's deployment of its maritime militia, these ships that look like fishing boats but have no fishing gear that will then go and occupy an area claimed by another country. Economic coercion is another good example of gray zone behavior. Hostage diplomacy, taking hostages, influence and interference campaigns are another. These are all gray zone type activities, and cyber can be part of that. Much as the use of the internet is very effective for promulgating views, for disinformation or information campaigns, for interference campaigns or influence campaigns. So cyber is very much a part of a gray zone effort in the periods leading up to a conflict. So I think as we've seen, for instance, Russia has used cyber very effectively to sow social unrest and discord in the United States through disinformation campaigns. China is not nearly as astute at doing it the way Russia has done it, but China has certainly used foreign media and cyber means to further its narrative and its information campaigns in the United States, and that's something that is quite concerning. But I think cyber has also been used for a long time by China to steal intellectual property and to conduct espionage. And they did that even when relations were much better between the two sides. For instance, in the 2012-2014 period, when some Chinese counterparts of mine would declare things like the U.S.-China relationship is the best it's ever been. But even when that relationship was the best it had ever been, China was still conducting cyber operations against the United States. And the U.S. and China entered into an agreement in 2015 that was supposed to stop the commercial intellectual property theft, but ultimately that wasn't followed, and cases of IP theft continued by use of cyber. So I think China is determined that they feel that it's necessary to use cyber as a tool for particularly intellectual property theft or the theft of technology, that they feel it's necessary to close technological gaps between the U.S. and China, or to give them a commercial competitive advantage, which they feel they're justified in doing because they feel disadvantaged. So from that perspective, I think cyber is going to continue because they feel it's necessary and it's effective. But you mentioned warfare. So cyber, of course, would have military applications if tension were to increase. I mean, cyber would certainly be used to influence public opinion, psychological operations, influence operations, interference operations. So that would be a key tool. And it could be used to change public opinion, to sow domestic unrest or create confusion amongst the public or even amongst policymakers. So cyber attacks could also be used to affect civilian networks, infrastructure that supports the economy, as well as the military. So I think cyber attacks against critical infrastructure would be certainly an escalation, one that would invite retaliation because of the chaos that it would cause. And your final question about whether or not the U.S. is ready, I'm not sure anyone is ready for all-out, unrestricted cyber warfare. I think the prospects of power outages, bank failures, essentially the tools of modern society as we know them ceasing to function would be very difficult for any society to sustain. So the ability to protect that infrastructure, I think, is limited, but it would be an evolution of attack and defense, and I think the two sides would go at it, and it would be very unpleasant for everyone involved.
Thank you for that very sophisticated answer. I have a very unsophisticated question for you as a follow-up. So should our viewers be scared of being spied on when they're using TikTok or other Chinese apps?
So I think I have a 13-year-old son, and he's very active on servers playing video games, and I think anyone should be afraid of any application on your phone, China's or otherwise, how it may collect your data, how it may use your data, how that data may be used against you. And I think it's as applicable on your game server as it is on your Facebook page, as it is on your WeChat group. So one has to be highly concerned. I think the fundamental difference, though, between the loss of your personal data over networks is in some cases Chinese applications have less restraints. There's less political checks and balances within the Chinese system to ensure that, for instance, if a your e-commerce site, if you're buying something on Amazon, you have an expectation that they will protect your data, and there is a U.S. legal system that will ensure that they do so, or else they will face significant punishments. That doesn't exist in China. So I think the accountability of Chinese applications is perhaps lower than U.S. ones. But at the end of the day, it's your data. You're responsible for protecting it. And if you lose your data and if it's used maliciously against you, whether you lost it because you played on TikTok or you played on PlayStation, I think is really not the key issue.
Got it. So we should be treating all all online social media apps and everything with equal suspicion, whether it be TikTok or China-based or other-based. And I completely agree with you on that. I have a kid myself, so I'm very cognizant of that.
But you definitely be suspicious.
Right, exactly. So thank you for the wonderful information you've provided us. Well, make sure to include all the information about Drew Thompson, our guest today, in the description below. So thank you for joining us today. I learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience also learned a lot. Before we let you go, though, is there anything that you want to tell us about what you're doing now, what you're doing in the future, any future plans that you would like us to kind of watch out for?
Well, I mean, obviously there's a lot going on in the world. Most of my current research is either looking at Taiwan politics and defense planning. I'm also focusing on Chinese foreign policy, including Chinese information campaigns, influence campaigns, and in some cases, interference campaigns. Basically how China's diplomacy has shifted and how many of their tactics have changed, not just towards the United States, but other countries, and how they seek to exert their influence and, when they feel necessary, interfere in other countries' internal affairs. So that's my current focus of research. The rest of the time, I'm teaching and enjoying my life here in Singapore, where every day is summer.
And you also write a lot of articles as well, right?
I try when I have time. I have a chapter coming out in the IISS Regional Security Assessment in a couple of weeks, looking at U.S.-China relations in 2020, and that will be available in June at the Shangri-La Dialogue.
Okay, fantastic. So we will be on the lookout for that. So if you have nothing else for our audience, thank you so much for your time. And we hope to see you maybe again next time right here on Second Gen's Liberated Panda. So thank you to Drew Thompson. Thank you to our guests at home. And we hope you guys have a wonderful day. Thank you, Drew. Have a great day.
My
Bye,
pleasure.
guys.